Hello and welcome to another Try Mechanics podcast. This podcast is a little bit different. We're going to go off on a little bit of a very specific subject related around cycling and training indoors. So the reason I decided to do this podcast was because I got embroiled in a bit of a Twitter debate relatively recently about the usefulness of training in your aero position or in your race position. How that affects essentially training indoors, whether you should be indeed training in the aero position on a turbo indoors, or whether it should be something that should be kept for outside. And there was a lot of different opinions being thrown across from different people, different levels of experience. And I thought it'd be a good idea to just think about or chat through why essentially these points have been made, and also what practical kind of tips can you take away, and what kind of my views are around this type of training, and whether what essentially we should be doing to kind of maximise our basically our indoor training when it comes to cycling. Okay, so firstly, I'm just going to explain a few terms that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be using the terms inertia and kinetic energy, relatively interchangeable, even though I know the physics professors in the room will say that they're not, which they aren't, but they encompass the same thing. They encompass this idea that essentially it's a measure of momentum. It's a measure of the idea that as you're essentially riding on the road, you carry a lot of kinetic energy because you are a 70, 80 kilo person on a 10 kilo bike, and you're going at a significant speed. Now, that idea, those things have become quite important concepts in turbo trainers, particularly recently. It was never really something that anyone was really that bothered with, and then they started realising that one of the main reasons why turbos don't tend to feel like the road is because of their ability to essentially hold or have that kinetic energy, because as you're pedaling that turbo away, you're not actually then going along the road and your body weight's not generating that momentum, and so it's very difficult for a turbo to generate that. The other thing we're talking about is things like flywheels. So a flywheel is the often the kind of weighted wheel that a lot of turbos have attached to them, that as you pedal, as you accelerate that wheel, it holds then that momentum, and these are used to generate, or essentially you put in the kinetic energy, and it's used to kind of hold that kinetic energy and give it back out in order for you to coast and essentially make the turbo feel a bit more like it's like you're riding outside. So I'm going to talk very briefly over the kind of the standard range of turbos that we've got and what they have in terms of their kinetic energy and the different spectrums. So we've got the kind of bottom end of the spectrum, we've got your rollers. Now, rollers are often said to feel like the road, and they really don't at all. They kind of feel like the road in terms of the fact that you're not in a fixed position. You can ride out the saddle, you can get in and out, and you can move around, or you can go side to side in them. But in terms of the inertia and that coasting, if you've ever ridden a set of rollers, the second you stop pedaling, you stop dead. And it's not like riding on the road at all. Essentially, riding on the rollers would be like riding up a very steep hill, where you constantly have to apply pressure, otherwise you're just going to come to a dead stop. So riding with rollers, particularly rollers with a set of resistance, like a headwind fan, for instance, that I used to have on my Kreitlers, would be a little bit like riding a mountain bike up a very dirty, muddy road. You're very, very low inertia, but having to put it in a lot of basically pedaling more of a circle. Now, the problem with training on rollers, and this is something that I actually experienced myself, is that spending a lot of time pedaling on rollers, you actually you essentially undermine your ability to pedal properly outside. Now, the reason that happens is because the muscles get used to pedaling in a circle, which we know is actually not correct. You shouldn't be trying to pedal in circles at all. Elite riders essentially push down harder and make use of that downstroke, and then on the opposite leg, they essentially unweight. So they don't pull up at all and pedal in a circle. They just don't allow that other limb to use its weight to slow down essentially the descending of the limb that's pushing downwards. Okay, so rollers are used often as warm-ups, but they shouldn't be used for long-term training at all, unless they are complemented with using a turbo that has higher inertia or riding on the road. If that's the case, then you're generally okay. It's just only if you spend all your time on the rollers that you might end up seeing a problem. Some people have no problems at all, and that all comes back to that neuromuscular patterning. We're going to be talking about that in a little bit. all the way up the spectrum, then you have different turbos of different levels of kinetic energy. Some with larger flywheels, so they have a bigger weight. That means that they can hold more kinetic energy. Some use like Le Monde Revolution, it's a very loud turbo that I've got, that uses a large fan. And because the large fan itself weighs a lot of, has a lot of weight to it, and it has a flywheel as well, it actually can generate or can hold a lot of kinetic energy as you put into it. Not quite like the road. We're talking in terms of numbers. We would be talking something along the lines of, on the road you might be using or holding 8,000 kilojoules of kinetic energy. Well, a Le Mans may get you 3,000, I think is the number. Now we've got very smart turbos. Now the problem with the smart turbos is that you don't know whether they're going to have the right kinetic energy just from looking at them. So something like a Wahoo Kicker that has been designed to have the kinetic energy of you sitting up, and essentially is all designed about connectivity, has very low kinetic energy because it has a very small flywheel, but also does generate a little bit of itself. And that has probably less than I think it has less than 1,000, but I'm not entirely sure. And they've got something like the Neo. So the Tax Neo is a completely different beast. Now, it was designed to be able to generate its own kinetic energy. So actually, that's a completely different way of thinking about it. So instead of having a flywheel that takes in the kinetic energy as you place it in there, it actually uses a motor and then magnets to not only generate the kinetic energy but also then slow you down. That's the beauty of the Neo. It's actually the braking, is the fact that as you try and accelerate your foot and push down hard on the road, you actually get a braking force. That's what you don't get from a lot of the turbos with a high kinetic energy from a large flywheel. So something like a Velotron or a King Cycle, something that had a large flywheel, that could spin up and that would hold lots of momentum, but actually it wasn't quite like the road, because as you spun up and you got lots of energy into that flywheel, it would keep spinning, and essentially you wouldn't get that bite back that when you push down hard that you get from on the road by the exponential increase in wind resistance. Okay, so and then you've got everything in the middle. If you've got the kind of fluid trainers and the magnetic trainers that are all much of a muchness when it comes to that side of things, probably the best of the bunch is something like a Kurt Kinetic that you can actually get the Pro flywheel. I definitely highly recommend that. The extra few kilos that it offers is really, really important in the ability to slightly more, simulate being out on the road in terms of that coasting effect. Okay, so that's what it all comes down to. So that's the important aspect. You've also got to remember that when you're riding on the road, there is essentially the effect of the wind coming up and just elevating your body ever so slightly. And this may not have much of an impact when you're sat up or on the hoods, but it does have an impact when you're riding in aero position, because it increases, essentially, it supposedly ever so slightly pushes you up off the seat just in the slightest amount, or essentially it works with you actually pushing down and then pushing yourself off the seat. That enables you to essentially increase in comfort and not put as much pressure at the front, or some people find that. It's not an absolute thing. Again, there's lots of other factors. The other thing to bear in mind with regards to that is that braking force that you get as you push down hard on the road, that is related to the increase in wind resistance, but also the rolling resistance of the road itself, pushes you up a little bit off the saddle. So actually, a lot of people find that they're more comfortable in aero position on the turbo, for instance, or on the road when they're pushing harder, because actually they're pushing themselves back off the saddle. So why is it all important? Well, the reason the debate came about was because a lot of people were saying that you can't really test FTP on all those factors if you're not in your race position on the turbo. Or if you're doing it on the turbo, then you shouldn't be using those numbers. Now, I completely disagree, because FTP is a physiological value. It is not related to position. It's related to position in the fact that a lot of people find that they can't put out as much of their FTP in aero position, but their FTP is still the same. It is a physiological state where you are about 40 minutes to 50 minutes long, where you're in that point around LT2, accumulating lactate, but just not enough to make you explode. And you can just about keep going, and then you hit a point where you don't hit a complete crisis point, but you just get to the point where suddenly the power starts to go down after about 40 to 50 minutes, which is akin to normally a 25-mile time trial. And the reason I say it's this kind of, it's called this kind of quasi kind of equilibrium state, because you're just producing enough lactate. If you were to go just above it, you suddenly produce a lot more lactate, you need to slow down very quickly. Or if you go just below it, you don't accumulate lactate anywhere near as fast, you're just about to clear it, and you can go for much longer. So that's why when it comes to critical power and this idea that it's not the same as CP60 or critical power 60, because that essentially is normally just below FTP. FTP is that bit just between the two where you can go, and it's very close and often can be only a few watts here and there. But the reason it's so important is it's used to then give us a marker for different physiological values from shorter stuff to longer stuff. And it has a reflection of things like VO2 max and other physiological things. It is not how much can I put out in this certain position. It is a percentage of that you're thinking of, really. So when you're thinking of whether testing your FTP in terms of race, let's say you're using FTP to gauge how much you should be able to put out for a length of a race, then yes, you probably need to have an idea of how good you are at riding in your FTP on road, as opposed to using your physiological value that you've derived from inside. Now, because it's a physiological value, both the getting that number and training it needs to take place in the most physiological advantageous state. And I talk about this at length in the fact that if you are trying to get used to a certain position, then yes, riding in that position biomechanically may be best, particularly if it's a situation outdoors. The problem is that you can't often train as well in aero position as you can sat up because of the constriction around the hips, because you're in an advantageous position in terms of the muscles, but also breathing and various other factors. So I like to separate my indoor training into fitness-based, physiological-based, where I will sit in the most comfortable position. Now, that could be down aero position for some people. It could be sat up, it could be on the hoods, it could be anywhere that is most comfortable. That is the critical thing. A lot of someone called Sam McCora's research is all about how fatigue and mental fatigue plays into endurance, and comfort is an important element of that. You must go for the most comfortable saddle indoors that suits the position that you're aiming to ride in. You must go for the most comfortable shoes that allow you, don't have excessive movement if you don't want it, that allow the right kind of application of force. You must have the biggest fan that you can get that will keep you nice and cool. If you're preparing for something like Hawaii, then doing specific sessions for heat stress is important. But generally, you need a large fan. I have an 18-inch high-velocity fan, and even that's only just enough when you're doing high-intensity sessions. If you are feeling warm on the turbo, you are compromising your ability to drive your fitness and your FTP. And that's what it all comes down to. You need to find the most physiological advantageous state. You need to close the doors, make sure you're not being distracted, put on the most motivating things that you can find. And this is why a lot of people gravitate towards things like sweet spot inside a kind of middle intensity, because it doesn't require that full-on motivation. It doesn't require necessarily full levels of concentration, comfort, and all those elements and cooling that mean that we don't get the most out of things. And this is why often people find sometimes they do better work on the turbo because they're less distracted by the road. But sometimes when they don't have a good turbo setup and they don't have a good fan and all those elements, they actually train better on the road because they can cool themselves and all those factors come into play. So, when it comes back to this debate about riding in aero position, it all depends on the turbo. If you have something like a watt bike that has a good amount of inertia or kinetic energy and can carry that due to the way the mechanism works with the fan and various other elements, or an Amond possibly, or a Neo, something that's got high kinetic energy potential, then yes, you can probably get away with riding in aero, but bearing in mind obviously that comfort side of things. Biomechanically speaking, yes, because the thing is that, as I say, if you're able to put out the power that you can put out, then you're not going to do yourself any harm if that's what you want to do. And actually, that'll translate nicely across the road. However, if you have a low kinetic energy turbo, so a standard turbo, a fluid, magnetic, or those side of things, you're probably going to do yourself disservice, because if you are unable to put out the same power and aero position in a turbo on your turbo that you can on road, and you must test this, then you are not going to be able to hit those physiological values that will enhance your FTP. And what you'll find is after months and months and months, your fitness won't have really changed. So you need to separate things. You need to do the hard work on the turbo sat up in the most comfortable position. And then you need to take that that physiology and put it into biomechanics, preferably outside in aero position, in your kind of rough race kit and that side of things. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to that biomechanics and that muscle firing element, they're very similar. So the patterns of pedaling a low inertia turbo sat up are very similar to pedaling a time trial bike going at high speed in aero position, but they're not the same. And that timing and patterning is something you can learn, but you can actually learn it really quickly. It's a little bit like if you were to put a swimmer in a pool swimmer in the pool all the time and then suddenly throw them into open water in a wetsuit. They'd probably struggle for the first swim or two. Relatively, they probably struggle relative to what they could do, probably not compared to other people because they were still a good swimmer, but they'll struggle a little bit, and it might take them a few swims for their brain to get used to the slightly different patterning, so the slightly different strain from the wetsuit, from the slightly different body position. But then it learns really quickly to apply what it was able to do in a slightly new pattern. Our nervous system works really, really fast. And this is why I came up with an argument of the fact that you could acclimatise in a few sessions. And I got told that wasn't the case at all. Well, actually, I believe it is. But you have to do the right sessions. So what you have to do is you have to get out on the road in a very nice, relaxed environment. No cars, no stress, in your race position. And not turn the power meter off. And ride extremely easily and relax down to that position. It's the same way that I approach running as a skill. As reconditioning that position is all approaching cycling as a skill. And you can only learn that new skill and that new patterning when you're relaxed, really, really relaxed. The brain has to be able to learn, and it will learn really, really quickly. As I say, the way I liken it to is if, again, go back to the analogy of playing the guitar. If you were to learn to play the guitar and you're an excellent guitarist and you always play the electric, and then somebody gives you an acoustic, for instance. Now, I've played lots of guitars. Most electric guitars have a very thin neck. That means you can play them very fast. Most acoustic and classical guitars have a very fat neck that allows you to essentially, or gives a better body and volume to playing and various different other elements, but they feel extremely different. But they've still got 6 strings, or they've still got strings, they've still got the same elements, and they're still played in roughly the same way. If you have to suddenly panic or you're thrown on stage, you're going to mess up all the notes and everything's going to all go awry because your brain won't be able to switch into the new pattern. But given an hour or so, maybe sitting down with that new guitar and feeling how it feels different, that's what you're trying to do. Your brain is trying to work out. It's like a taste test. Why is this different? When it's different, when we've worked out why it's different, we can put something in place. So your brain is trying to work out, why does this position feel different? If it can work that out, then it can change the patterning subtly to make that work, and it can happen very quickly. But if it's not given the time, it can't. Okay, so I've gone over a few things there. So just to summarise, if you have a turbo that has that high kinetic energy, something like a Neo or a kinetic with a flywheel or a Le Mans, or a Watt bike is another very popular example, then you may be able to get away with pedalling and you're doing good physiological work in aero position indoors. If not, then do your work in the most comfortable position with the biggest fan available and all that motivation to get the most physiology. Then take that to the road, knowing that you'll adapt very quickly if you go into your bike, your race position on your bike on the road when the weather gets better if you want to get outside. And take that approach as opposed to trying to constantly hammer away and not really make any gains if in aero position indoors. And I believe it often constricts that ability to make those good gains because you're not allowed to breathe as hard because you're a bit constricted in the lungs and all those different factors that might end up slowing you down. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that helps a little bit to settle that debate just a little bit or make you something to think about. Any questions about this, please just let me know. Thank you very much. Goodbye.